Her heel clipped my travel bag. My son's wife didn't even flinch. Still, I knelt to lift it, slow and calm, as if I hadn't seen her smirk. As the overhead chime called for boarding, she smiled, like the seat was hers. While she floated forward on borrowed charm, I held the ticket I'd paid for, alone. The same worn leather she shoved was the one thing with my name on it. That's when I walked past her. First class, first boarded, first free. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Margaret Grayson arrived at Charleston International Airport with a quiet thrill. The airport buzzed around her, travelers dragging their bags along polished floors, murmuring under the soft hum of announcements. She wasn't in a rush, no tight connections to catch. Just time to breathe, time to savor. The spring trip to California with Andrew, Kendra, and Olivia had been a gift. A gesture, really. Something that seemed like a balm after months of distance, both physical and emotional. She was a mother first, but always a grandmother. And this trip could be something special for Olivia. She trailed behind them at check-in, watching the family hustle ahead. Andrew, perpetually trying to keep peace, was already fiddling with his phone, probably managing the details Kendra insisted on overseeing. Kendra, as usual, rushed ahead. A perfectly polished presence, leaving no room for mistakes, certainly not in the world she created around her. Margaret reached down to lift her small travel bag, the soft leather worn from years of use, and just as she moved to pull it toward her, Kendra's heel struck it sharply. It was an accident, perhaps, but it carried all the weight of intention. "Watch where you leave your things." Kendra's voice sliced through the quiet hum of the airport, the sharpness of it just barely veiling something colder underneath. Margaret felt the briefest tug of embarrassment, but it didn't last. She steadied the bag, taking a beat to compose herself. The noise around her seemed to disappear for a second as she looked down at her small travel bag. Hers, bought and packed with years of memories in mind. She could feel Olivia's gaze, lingering with hesitation, her granddaughter's empathy always stronger than Kendra's indifference. Olivia didn't speak, but Margaret could sense the confusion in her eyes. It was clear to Margaret. Olivia saw what no one else did. Andrew was too preoccupied, his attention too diverted by the swirl of activity around them to notice. He didn't step in, didn't say anything, his neutrality settling like a fog between them. Margaret felt the familiar pang of disappointment. It wasn't new, it wasn't surprising. She wasn't asking him to fight her battles, but the silence was growing loud with each passing year. Margaret straightened up, looking past Kendra, allowing the briefest of moments for her shoulders to settle. She was used to carrying the weight, carrying things no one noticed, and she'd learned long ago how to not let it show. Kendra continued ahead, unfazed, her heels clicking in rhythm with her self-assurance, her every step a declaration of territory claimed. Margaret didn't react. Instead, she quietly checked her boarding pass. The crisp paper, the weight of it in her hands, the familiar thrill of the flight that she'd booked months before. The ticket was hers, matching her name to the seat reserved in first class. She'd paid for it. It was hers, and nothing was going to change that. She allowed herself a small, secret smile, nothing too overt, but enough to acknowledge the small victory she'd already won. It wasn't about the seat on the plane, though. It wasn't about the first-class ticket or the subtle power move she'd made by booking it herself. It was about something else, something deeper. It was the smallest of reminders to herself that she wasn't invisible, that she was still here, still fighting for the dignity no one could take away. As she walked toward the gate, she felt Kendra's presence behind her, her impatience crackling like static in the air. Kendra's silence said it all, the quiet fury that Margaret had learned to read long ago. But it was Olivia who gave her a fleeting glance, a look that spoke volumes, And in that brief exchange, Margaret knew something was shifting, even if she couldn't yet name it. "Excuse me, ma'am, can I see your boarding pass?" The voice of the gate agent cut through the moment. Margaret turned, eyes steady, and handed over the small piece of paper, feeling the weight of the years packed into it. This wasn't just a ticket, it was a declaration, a promise. As the agent scanned it, Kendra appeared behind her, tossing a glance at Margaret's pass. The agent's face remained neutral, but Margaret could feel the quiet tension stretching across the short distance between them. "You'll need to check this," the agent said, her voice calm, but Margaret could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. "This seat isn't under your name, ma'am." Margaret felt a sudden sharpness in her chest. For a second, her breath caught. Was it a mistake? Had something gone wrong with the reservation? But she steadied herself. Her fingers tightened around the boarding pass. She had checked everything twice, and there was no mistake. "I booked this seat," Margaret replied, her voice firm, clear. She didn't look at Kendra, didn't need to. Her focus was on the agent, on the small but critical detail. The agent nodded, her gaze flicking back to the ticket in her hand. "I'm sorry, ma'am, I'll need to check this further." Kendra's face tightened with frustration, but Margaret didn't let herself be pulled into the storm of it. She knew her truth. She knew who belonged here. And as the seconds stretched out in that quiet tension, Margaret felt something shift, deeper than just a boarding pass. A moment where respect had slipped through the cracks, and she was the only one who'd noticed. In the distance, she could hear Olivia's soft footsteps behind her, the sound of someone who was finally learning to walk beside rather than follow. The moment stretched taut, like the hush just before a storm. The gate agent stared at the boarding pass, her expression neutral but her eyes flickering to Kendra's impatient gaze. Margaret stood still, her grip on the armrest of the chair next to her tightening as the silence lingered. She could feel Kendra's gaze burning into the back of her neck, could almost hear the thoughts swirling in that sleek, polished head. But she didn't budge. Not this time. Kendra stepped forward, a swift, confident move, her heels clicking with purpose. Her hand reached for the boarding pass before the agent could say another word. Margaret felt the edge of something shifting in her chest, a tightening, as if the world were slowly tilting away from her. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't wanted this confrontation, but it was here, like a thundercloud gathering just above her. The agent glanced down at Kendra's itinerary, her fingers tapping the edge of the paper in a rhythm that felt almost detached. It should have been a seamless process. The gate agent should have smiled, checked the details, and sent them all on their way. But instead, the agent's brow furrowed. "Ma'am, this seat isn't under your name," she said, her voice soft but firm, the words slipping into the space between them like a blade. Kendra blinked, her expression cracking into confusion for the first time since this whole trip had begun. Her posture stiffened, a flash of panic flickering across her perfectly composed features. She turned to Andrew, her eyes narrowing with a mix of disbelief and frustration. "Didn't you say she changed it?" Kendra's voice was sharp, almost accusatory, as though Andrew had betrayed her, as though this mistake was somehow his fault. She tilted her head toward Margaret, who had remained quiet, watching from the side, a stillness in her demeanor that felt like the calm before the tidal wave. Andrew looked up from his phone, a slight frown tugging at his brow as he glanced at the agent. The cloud of conflict settled heavier on his shoulders, and Margaret could feel it, could feel the weight of the years in his indecision. She wasn't surprised by the lack of intervention, his neutrality, his fear of confrontation. It had always been the same. Kendra's fingers gripped her own boarding pass as if she could will it into submission, but the agent only glanced back at Margaret. Margaret's heart beat steady in her chest. She reached into her bag and pulled out her own boarding pass, sliding it across the counter with a smoothness that made the gesture feel deliberate. Her hand was calm, as though the world hadn't just tilted, as though there hadn't been a moment of tension so palpable it could be sliced through. The agent's gaze shifted between the two passes, the confusion clearing for a moment as she scanned Margaret's ticket once again. Her eyes softened, understanding dawning. "This ticket is under your name, ma'am," she said, her voice quieter now. The weight of what she'd said hung there between them, a shift that Kendra could feel, even if she couldn't fully understand it. Margaret didn't smile. She didn't need to. Instead, she gave a small nod, her gaze steady. "I booked this seat. For myself." The words were simple, but in them, there was an entire history. A history Kendra had ignored, a history Andrew had allowed to slip away. For a moment, Kendra didn't move. Her mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. Then, without a word, the agent turned to Kendra and directed her to a different part of the boarding gate, the one where seats in economy waited, far from the front where Margaret stood. The shift in power was quiet, but it was there, and Margaret could feel the smallest spark of something rise in her chest, a flicker of the independence she'd let slip for too long. Without waiting for anyone, Margaret turned and walked toward the jet bridge. Her steps were deliberate, each footfall a reaffirmation of her presence. She didn't glance back at Kendra. She didn't need to. Margaret could hear Kendra muttering under her breath, hear the sting in her voice as she was sent to the back of the line. But Margaret kept walking, feeling the cool air of the jet bridge surrounding her, the thrill of it, the thrill of something she hadn't experienced in far too long. Freedom. Space. A place where she could move without being boxed in by the expectations of others. She passed through the gate, the attendant smiling at her as she continued down the narrow corridor. She wasn't in a rush. She never had been. She was just walking to her seat, walking toward the part of her life she'd begun to reclaim. The first-class cabin awaited her, a space that felt far more than just luxury. It felt like a declaration. In the distance, she could hear Kendra's voice rising again, sharp and full of disbelief. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt no need to turn around. She'd had enough of that. Her seat was waiting. And as she settled into it, adjusting the small pillow on her lap, she smiled softly to herself. It wasn't just about the seat. It wasn't even about the trip. It was about knowing that she was finally in the right place, for herself. The hum of the plane was like a lullaby, steady and calming, as Margaret sank deeper into her seat. She rested her head back on the plush headrest, the champagne glass lightly clinking in her fingers as she took another sip. The bubbles tickled her nose, the crispness sharp yet refreshing. She barely noticed the occasional turbulence. The sky was clear, but even if it weren't, she'd learned to find peace amidst the storms. She glanced at the paperback in her lap, a novel she'd picked up just before boarding. It was light, a bit predictable, but she wasn't really reading it. Her eyes lingered on the words, her mind wandering in a different direction entirely. The truth was, Margaret wasn't just here for the scenery or the luxury. She had learned something in the past month, a lesson she hadn't realized she was learning until now. Down the aisle, in row 21, Kendra sat with her arms crossed, her face turned toward the window. Margaret had seen that look many times before, the subtle tension of a woman who expected the world to bend in her favor and found, for the first time in a long time, that it didn't. Kendra's sleek perfection couldn't mask the quiet storm of frustration that radiated from her, a wave of coldness that made it all the more evident. She wasn't in control anymore. The thought brought a small smile to Margaret's lips. Though she wasn't gloating, she wasn't the type. But that didn't mean she couldn't take a moment to appreciate the silence, the distance between them, and the clarity she was beginning to feel. It hadn't been that long ago when Margaret had walked into Sutton and Parrish Financial, stepping out of the car in the soft light of an early spring morning. The building was an old stone structure, reliable and stoic in its appearance, much like the kind of business Andrew had always worked with. She had told him she was going in to close the travel account they had opened years ago, the one he used for their trips. She didn't need the reminder anymore. The doorbell chimed as she entered, and Daniel Parrish looked up with a soft smile. He was a calm man, quiet, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. As a financial advisor, he'd always been an anchor for Margaret, one of the few people who treated her like she still had a seat at the table. "You're not here for the usual, are you?" Daniel's voice was warm, but there was a note of curiosity as he stood up from behind his desk. Margaret returned the smile, though it was faint. "No, Daniel. I'm here to close the account Andrew's been using." The look on Daniel's face shifted just the smallest bit, his eyes flicking to the paperwork that had been handled in the past few months. He knew enough about the family dynamics to keep quiet, but he was professional, and professionalism meant asking the right questions. "Would you like me to freeze any shared funds? Or redirect them?" Daniel asked, his tone steady but cautious. He wasn't sure if he was dealing with a temporary impulse or something more permanent. Margaret paused for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders. She wasn't impulsive, not in the way Kendra was. Her choices had always been deliberate, calculated. But this time, she wasn't about to let anyone dictate the course of her life. "No," she replied, her voice clear. "I'd like to reroute them." She smiled faintly. "All of them, into my own account. It's time." Daniel nodded, as if he had been expecting something like this. He didn't ask any further questions, didn't pry into the personal reasons behind the decision. Margaret appreciated that. He simply turned to his computer, his fingers moving quickly over the keys as he made the necessary arrangements. The process took only a few moments. He glanced at her once more, his gaze saying more than words ever could, before he finalized the changes. It was done. When Margaret left Sutton and Parrish, the world outside felt just a little different. Lighter, almost. Her first call after leaving the bank had been to Sandra Lowe, her travel agent of many years at Palmetto Pines. Margaret didn't hesitate when Sandra picked up. "Just double-checking," Margaret had said, the words rolling off her tongue with a certain finality. "Seat 2A? It's under my name only, right?" Sandra's voice was reassuring. "Of course, Margaret. I've already confirmed it. That seat is yours, and only yours." Margaret had nodded to herself, pleased, as she hung up. It wasn't just a seat on a plane. It was her reclamation. Her step toward regaining what had been taken from her, not just by Kendra, but by years of quiet compromise and decisions made by others. Now, as the plane coasted through the sky, Margaret let her gaze wander back toward the seat Kendra occupied. The woman in row 21 had no idea what had happened behind the scenes, no inkling of the decisions Margaret had made quietly, without anyone's approval. For a moment, Margaret let herself feel the satisfaction of being exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she wanted to do, free of anyone else's influence. The future was clearer now, a bit more solid. She was beginning to understand just how much power she'd been holding onto all along. And as the flight continued, Margaret let herself lean back, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her champagne glass. She had made her move. The game had shifted. And as for Kendra, Margaret could hear the sharpness in her muttered complaints, but she didn't care. She had a seat at the front now. Kendra could wait in economy. The hotel room was quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the muted sounds of the city drifting up from the street below. Margaret stood by the window, staring out at the skyline, watching the shadows stretch long across the buildings as the sun sank lower in the sky. She hadn't been in a rush to unpack. There was no need to hurry. The small, familiar comfort of this space, a simple hotel room, but hers alone, was a temporary refuge. Across the room, Kendra paced, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. Every movement was taut with frustration, every step measured with purpose. She was trying to control her anger, but it was slipping through the cracks. Margaret had known this moment was coming, had known the tension between them wouldn't stay bottled up for long. The quiet had been an illusion, and now it was time for the storm to break. Andrew hovered in the doorway, looking like he wanted to disappear. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets. His shoulders hunched as though bracing for impact. The years of trying to please everyone were written all over his face. He was caught between his mother and his wife, trying to be the bridge, but Margaret could see that the cracks in that bridge were widening with every passing second. Kendra stopped pacing and turned to face Margaret, her eyes narrowed with something sharp. Resentment, anger, disbelief. "I don't know what game you're playing," Kendra said, her voice low but seething. She'd been holding this in for too long. "But you need to understand something. You can't just walk in here and take what doesn't belong to you." Margaret didn't flinch. She wasn't afraid of Kendra's words. She'd heard worse in the quiet of her own home. Instead, she slowly turned away from the window, her movements deliberate, controlled. She walked to the small desk where her suitcase lay open, neatly arranged, as though she had all the time in the world. The space felt almost too still, too calm in contrast to the storm building behind her. "It's not a game," Margaret said, her voice steady but carrying an edge that Kendra hadn't expected. "You just assumed the seat was yours. You assumed a lot of things." Kendra's breath hitched, the tension in her shoulders suddenly visible as she took a step forward, her words cutting through the air like shards of glass. "You used our money to book that seat, didn't you?" Her eyes were fierce, like a predator finally cornering its prey. "You didn't even ask. You just took." Margaret didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulling out a printed statement, something that had been tucked away for just such a moment. It was small, just a few sheets of paper, but it carried weight. She handed it to Kendra without a word, the paper crinkling faintly as she passed it over. Kendra's fingers trembled slightly as she took the statement. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the document with increasing disbelief. Margaret watched her, the silence between them stretching. Kendra's face twisted as she realized what she was holding in her hands, the proof, clear as day, that the money for the plane ticket had come from Margaret's own private account. No shared funds, no family money, just Margaret's. The color drained from Kendra's face, replaced by something darker. You've been planning this," she whispered, the shock settling into anger, now thick and sharp. Her voice cracked as she fought to maintain control, but it was slipping. "This whole time, you've been plotting." Margaret said nothing. She didn't need to defend herself, not anymore. The numbers were there in black and white, clear and unchangeable. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about the seat. It was about something much bigger. Something Kendra couldn't understand. Something Margaret hadn't even realized was slowly building inside her until now. Andrew shifted uncomfortably in the doorway, his eyes darting between his wife and his mother. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was caught in the crossfire again, just as he always was. His silence louder than any of Kendra's accusations. Margaret didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Kendra's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She took a step forward, her voice shaking. "You're not going to get away with this. You think you can just—" Margaret held up her hand, stopping her in her tracks. The gesture wasn't one of power, not exactly, but it was enough to make Kendra pause, to make her reconsider, even if only for a moment. "I'm not trying to get away with anything," Margaret said softly. "I'm simply taking back what's mine." Kendra's jaw tightened, her nostrils flaring as she tried to steady her breathing. Andrew finally spoke, his voice weak, desperate. "Mom, can't we just—" "No." Margaret interrupted him, her tone final. We can't just pretend everything's fine anymore. There's no more pretending. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with everything that had been unsaid for years. Margaret could feel it, could feel the weight of the years she had spent in the background, always accommodating, always taking a step back. But not anymore. This was the moment where everything shifted, where she no longer played by anyone's rules, but her own. For the first time in what felt like ages, Margaret let herself feel something other than the burden of obligation. She was done. Done with the games, done with being overlooked, done with being taken for granted. She stepped toward her suitcase, calmly continuing to unpack, as though the storm behind her hadn't just begun to break. She had made her decision. She had taken control. And the world around her, Andrew, Kendra, the years of compromises and silences, they were all starting to crumble. Kendra stood there, frozen for a moment, unable to speak. And Margaret, with quiet dignity, began to fold her clothes, one piece at a time, as if the world were starting to settle into the shape of something new. Margaret stepped out of the hotel with no particular destination in mind, though a small part of her had been looking forward to this. An afternoon to herself. She'd been in the background long enough. Now she was going to carve out her own space. A quiet, unhurried moment that was entirely her own. She didn't ask anyone else to join her. Kendra was preoccupied with her frustrations, and Andrew, well, he wouldn't even notice. Not truly. The botanical garden was only a short walk from the hotel, a lush expanse of greenery that felt like an oasis tucked away from the busy streets of the city. The air was thick with the scent of flowers, the kind of sweetness that seemed to fill the lungs with something like calm. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows across the paths. Birds called out from the treetops, their songs punctuating the otherwise peaceful silence. She had no itinerary, no rush. She wandered the garden at her own pace, letting her feet take her wherever the soft paths curved, wherever the next patch of color drew her in. It had been years since she'd allowed herself to feel this unencumbered, this free to simply be. As she made her way toward the tram stop, a man seated nearby caught her eye. He was older, dressed in a faded flight jacket with patches sewn into the sleeves. He looked out of place in the quiet calm of the garden, as if he had just stepped off a plane himself. But there was something welcoming in his demeanor, something familiar about the way his eyes twinkled with unspoken stories. "Afternoon," Margaret said, offering a polite smile as she approached. The man looked up, and his face softened with the kind of warmth that only comes from years of experience. "Afternoon," he replied, tipping his hat slightly. "You a traveler or just passing through?" Margaret hesitated for a moment, then took the empty seat beside him. "A little of both, I suppose." He nodded knowingly. "I know the feeling. Been in and out of airports all my life. Retired pilot now. You never really leave it behind, do you? The air, the travel, the constant motion." Margaret chuckled, the sound light and easy. "I thought I had left it behind, but I'm beginning to think there's always a part of us that keeps moving, even when we're standing still." The tram arrived, its bell ringing lightly. The old man stood, offering her a hand as they climbed aboard. As the tram rolled along the winding paths, they talked. About flying, about life, about the strange way time seems to slip away when you least expect it. He told stories of airports he'd seen change, of families he'd flown with, of the small moments of connection that made it all worthwhile. When they stopped at the overlook, Margaret turned to him with a thoughtful look. "You ever regret anything?" He considered this, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Not really. At least, not in the way you're asking. But I do know this. Loyalty and family, they're the things that matter most." Doesn't matter what you give up or what you gain. If you got those two, everything else falls into place. Margaret's heart stilled for a moment, her gaze drifting to the distant horizon. Her late husband's face flashed in her mind, as vivid as if he were standing beside her. She could almost hear his voice, soft and steady, reminding her of the way he used to speak of their family. He believed, Margaret said quietly, her voice a little distant, that presence mattered more than promises. The old man nodded, as if he understood exactly what she meant. "Good man," he said softly before turning back to the view. As the tram continued its journey, Margaret's thoughts shifted back to the hotel. She imagined Kendra complaining about the hotel points, no doubt. The woman never could accept that her perfect world wasn't always perfect, especially now that Sandra had blocked their shared card. Kendra would seethe, no doubt, as she tried to get everything to align. Meanwhile, Andrew would silently attempt to mediate, caught in the middle of it all, just as he always was. Margaret smiled at the thought. This trip wasn't the one they had planned. It wasn't the trip they had imagined. But it was the one that was unfolding before her, and it was more real, more hers, than anything she had expected. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, a soft smile pulling at the corner of her lips when she saw the name. Olivia. "I like your version of this trip better." Margaret's fingers moved quickly, her heart warming as she typed a response. "How about lunch tomorrow? Just us. Meet me at Cafe Amelia, 12:30. No strings. Just us." She hit send, leaning back in her seat as she waited for the tram to make its slow way back to the entrance. For the first time in a long time, she felt a shift, a quiet certainty that what she was doing, who she was becoming, was exactly right. Olivia was the future, and perhaps she was the key to something else too. Not just loyalty, not just family, but freedom. Margaret had never planned this trip, but it was hers, every moment of it. And when the tram rolled to a stop, Margaret stepped off, the cool air of the garden filling her lungs, her steps purposeful and unhurried. There was no need to rush back. Not today. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The phone rang in the quiet of the morning, the soft, insistent sound pulling Andrew from the haze of sleep. He reached over to grab it from the nightstand, squinting at the screen as he rubbed his eyes. It was the bank. His heart sank, a familiar knot of anxiety forming in his chest. "Hello?" he mumbled, still groggy from a restless night of trying to mediate an argument between Kendra and Margaret that seemed to have no end. "Mr. Grayson?" came the crisp, professional voice on the other end. "This is Daniel Parrish from Sutton and Parrish Financial. I'm calling to inform you that the remodel funds you requested have been declined." Andrew's pulse quickened. "What? That's impossible. I've got plenty of room in the account." "There's an issue with the originating trust," Daniel said, his tone matter of fact. "The account has been updated. You're no longer linked to it." "Wait. What?" Andrew's voice rose, disbelief creeping in. He sat up in bed, his mind scrambling. "What do you mean I'm not linked anymore? That trust was redirected," Daniel interrupted gently. "It's been redirected into another account. I can send you the details if you like." Andrew's thoughts spun as he clutched the phone tighter, the weight of the conversation starting to sink in. Is this some kind of mistake? How could I not be linked? That's our money. It's for the house, the remodel, everything. I'm afraid it's all been redirected. You'll need to check with your... Daniel hesitated. "Your mother." The line went dead silent for a moment. Andrew's mind reeled. He felt like the ground had shifted beneath him, and suddenly, the world he thought he knew didn't make sense anymore. His breath caught in his chest as something, a terrible, familiar something, began to dawn on him. Margaret. He hung up the phone without another word, pushing himself out of bed. The house felt suffocating, too quiet in the aftermath of the phone call. He found Kendra in the kitchen, her back to him, her hair pulled tightly into a bun. She was already dressed for the day, her movements sharp, almost frenzied as she rifled through papers on the counter. "What's going on?" Andrew asked, trying to steady his voice. But the panic was there, just beneath the surface. "I just got off the phone with the bank. The remodel funds. They're gone." "What the hell happened?" Kendra whirled around, her eyes flashing with frustration. "I told you, she's sabotaging us. Your mother. She's behind all of this." Andrew's stomach tightened. "What?" "No, Kendra, she wouldn't." "Of course she would." Kendra's voice rose, her hands trembling with barely contained anger. "She's always had to have control, hasn't she? Always pulling strings behind the scenes, making sure she's in charge. This was her plan all along, to drain the account, to get rid of us, to leave us with nothing." Andrew rubbed his temples, his mind trying to process it. "Kendra, listen to yourself. We've been using that trust for years. It was part of our foundation. Why would Mom?" "Because she knows," Kendra hissed, her voice almost a snarl now. "She knows you won't fight her. She's got you wrapped around her finger and she's using that to destroy everything we've worked for." Andrew didn't know how to respond. He couldn't argue with the growing fear, the doubt that crept into his thoughts. But something in him, the part of him that still remembered his mother's sacrifices, refused to believe it. This wasn't her. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing, the weight of everything pressing in. He had never seen Margaret like this, had never imagined her capable of doing something like this. But now, with the trust in question and the funds gone, it was all too clear. "Kendra, we need to get the full details," Andrew said, his voice trembling slightly. "I'll call Daniel back. Maybe there's been some sort of mistake." "You think she'll tell you the truth?" Kendra shot back, her face twisted in disbelief. "She's already won, Andrew. She has what she wants." But Andrew's mind was already elsewhere. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than a simple bank transfer or misplaced funds. The trust had been redirected. That wasn't something that happened by accident. He grabbed his phone again, dialing Daniel's number. The phone rang once, twice, before the line picked up. "Daniel," Andrew said quickly, his words clipped. "I need you to send me the details about the trust. Who authorized the change? I need to know exactly what happened." "I'm afraid I can't provide that information, Mr. Grayson." Daniel's voice was calm but firm. "The update was initiated by your mother. She's the one who made the decision to move the funds." Andrew's mind went blank for a moment. His hands were shaking as he held the phone to his ear. "What do you mean? She made the decision?" "The originating trust was updated last month," Daniel continued. "Margaret Grayson is now the sole account holder." The words hit Andrew like a cold slap to the face. The realization spread like ice through his veins. His mother had taken control of the trust, the funds that had once been part of their shared life, part of his own future, were now in her hands alone. He dropped the phone onto the counter, the sudden weight of betrayal nearly overwhelming him. Kendra stood behind him, her voice almost a whisper. "I told you. She's been planning this all along." Margaret's quiet move, her decision to redirect the funds, felt more like a declaration than a theft. She had taken what was rightfully hers, yes. But in doing so, she had also claimed something Andrew hadn't known was hers to begin with. Complete control. Margaret was no longer just a mother, no longer just a distant figure in his life. She had become something else entirely. And Andrew realized, too late, that the game had shifted without him even noticing. Margaret sat at her small desk in the hotel room, the light from the desk lamp casting a warm glow on the papers spread before her. She had learned to make decisions like this in the quiet moments, where the world outside was distant, hushed, and no one could see her thinking. The decision had been a long time coming, but it felt right now. She took a slow breath and dialed the number she had known by heart for years. Palmetto Pines Travel. Sandra Lowe speaking, came the familiar voice after the second ring. Sandra, Margaret greeted, her voice soft but firm. I need you to make some changes. Remove Kendra and Andrew from all linked travel plans. They are no longer authorized to book through us. There was a brief pause, the sound of Sandra typing on her keyboard echoing through the phone. Already done, Sandra said, her voice warm but efficient. I've flagged them. They won't be able to book anything through us again. You're all set. Margaret allowed herself a small, quiet smile, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her coffee cup. It wasn't about control. It was about clarity. It was about protecting what was hers and making sure nothing would be taken from her again. Thank you, Sandra, Margaret said, her voice cool, the decision already made. She hung up and turned her attention to her phone. A quick glance at the screen told her Olivia had sent her a message. Margaret's heart gave a soft lurch of warmth as she opened the text. Lunch tomorrow? No strings, just soup. Margaret's fingers danced over the screen, typing quickly. I'll be there. 12:30 at Cafe Amelia. She hit send and leaned back in her chair, the weight of the moment slowly lifting from her shoulders. Olivia had always been a comfort, even in the midst of everything else. She wasn't bound by the same rules, the same expectations that had shaped Andrew and Kendra. Olivia had seen it all, the struggles, the sacrifices, the silent battles Margaret had fought to keep her family together. And now, Margaret was offering her something else, a chance to truly connect, away from the noise, away from all the clutter that had built up over the years. As Margaret put the phone down, a knock came at the door. She stood slowly, the familiar hesitation of a visit from Kendra or Andrew settling in her chest. When she opened it, Olivia stood on the other side, her eyes wide with something between concern and curiosity. Grandma, Olivia asked, stepping into the room. Are you okay? Margaret smiled, the expression gentle, though there was something unmistakable in her eyes. I'm fine, sweetheart. More than fine, actually. Olivia studied her for a long moment, then stepped closer, lowering her voice. Mom's scared of you now. Margaret's smile deepened, and for the first time in days she felt something light stir in her chest. She should have been kind before she got confident, Margaret replied, her voice quiet but resolute. Olivia seemed to take a moment to absorb the words, then she nodded slowly. Yeah, she's always been like that, too busy fighting for control. Margaret nodded, her expression softening. Some things, Olivia, are worth fighting for. But not everything. Not everything requires a fight. Sometimes, it's about knowing when to step back, or when to take control. Olivia sat down on the edge of the bed, crossing her legs. Will you still travel? She asked, her voice suddenly filled with a quiet wonder. Margaret looked out the window, her gaze distant for a moment. She thought of all the places she had yet to see, of all the trips she had dreamed of taking but had put off for years. The adventure had always been there, waiting, but it had always been overshadowed by everyone else's needs. Not anymore. She turned to Olivia, her expression sharp and decisive. More now than ever. Olivia's eyes brightened, a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. You're really doing this, aren't you? Margaret's heart gave a quiet, satisfied thud. Yes, and it's long overdue. A sense of quiet certainty filled the room, the air around them thick with something unspoken, something that had been brewing for a long time. Margaret had given so much of herself, tried so hard to be everything for everyone, and now, she was simply going to be herself. As she looked at Olivia, she saw something else too. A kindred spirit. Someone who understood that life wasn't about fighting for dominance, but about finding balance, about carving out moments of peace in the chaos. "I'll be at the cafe tomorrow," Margaret said softly. "Just us. No distractions." Olivia nodded eagerly. "I'm looking forward to it. Just us." Margaret gave her a soft smile, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of all that she had let go. The pain, the disappointments, the betrayals. It was all still there, but it no longer had the power to control her. She was stepping into the next chapter of her life, and this time, she wasn't alone. As Olivia left to give her space, Margaret took a deep breath, letting the silence fill her. The world had shifted, and in that moment, it felt right. Everything had changed, but Margaret Grayson had finally found her place, and nothing, not even Kendra or Andrew, could take that from her. The hum of the airport echoed around Margaret as she stood at the baggage claim, watching the endless stream of luggage circle by. The tired faces of returning travelers, worn from the long journey, moved around her like a blur. She was glad to be back, but something about the chaos of the airport still felt familiar, like a storm always waiting to break. She noticed Kendra first, her designer sunglasses perched atop her head, her posture stiff with frustration. Kendra was standing at the carousel, peering over the crowd, her lips pressed tightly together. She had been uncharacteristically quiet since the flight had landed, her usual confidence faltering in the wake of the changes Margaret had made. Kendra's bag, a sleek black leather piece with polished gold hardware, was nowhere in sight. Margaret felt a flicker of something. Was it satisfaction? She didn't know. She had nothing to gain from Kendra's distress, but something in her was quietly aware of the irony in the moment. Kendra, who had spent so much time commanding every corner of her life, was now caught in a simple, inconvenient situation. She could feel the pull of the moment, the weight of it settling on her shoulders. She didn't speak. She didn't move. As the seconds passed, Kendra's anxiety grew. She adjusted her sunglasses, scanning the crowd again, her eyes widening as the bag failed to appear. "Where is it?" Kendra muttered under her breath, her voice rising slightly. She turned to Andrew, who was standing a few feet away, looking at his phone. "Andrew, did you see my bag?" Andrew glanced up, clearly distracted. "What? No, I didn't see it. Is it not here?" Kendra's face tightened with frustration. "It's not here. Why isn't it here? It's supposed to be here." Margaret watched, unblinking, as Kendra began pacing in the small area near the carousel, her steps sharp and quick. Her heels clicked against the tile with each frantic stride. She was losing her grip, and Margaret could see it in the way Kendra's body stiffened, in the way she clenched her hands. Andrew moved closer, trying to calm her. "Kendra, it's probably just delayed. Let me talk to someone." But Kendra wasn't having it. "No, I'm not waiting around. I'll file a complaint." Her voice was rising now, sharp and demanding. "This is ridiculous. They can't just lose a designer bag like that." Margaret stood back, silently observing. She didn't intervene, not this time. She had seen this before. Kendra's need to control every situation, her need to turn every inconvenience into a crisis. But there was no crisis here. Only a small, petty moment of misfortune. Kendra approached the airline desk, her movements quick and jerky. She began filing a complaint, her voice loud enough to draw a few curious glances. Margaret didn't watch her closely. Instead, she kept her eyes on the carousel, knowing that the moment was still unfolding. A few minutes passed. Margaret didn't budge. She just waited, feeling the weight of the moment, the quiet release of control that seemed to settle over her. She could hear Kendra's raised voice now, a frustrated string of words, but Margaret didn't let herself become caught in it. She'd already made her decision. She didn't need to be part of this spectacle. Then, just as the carousel slowed, Margaret noticed something. a figure in a security uniform walking toward her. He was holding Kendra's bag in his hand, the leather gleaming under the harsh overhead lights. But something was off. The bag was open, the flap hanging loosely, and there was a distinct dark stain of rainwater across it. Margaret's breath caught for just a moment. She watched as the security guard approached Kendra, who had now turned, her face flushed with a mix of anger and relief. "Ma'am, your bag," the security guard said, handing it over. "It was misplaced, and then left out on the tarmac in the rain. Sorry about that." Kendra snatched the bag from his hands, her fingers brushing against the wet leather. Her face twisted with fury as she inspected it, the rainwater still visible on the surface. "This is ridiculous," she spat. "How do you lose my bag and then ruin it? This is designer." The security guard remained silent, his expression unreadable. He simply nodded and turned, walking away without another word. Andrew, who had been standing a few paces behind, approached cautiously, clearly trying to avoid further escalation. "Kendra, let's just go. It's not a big deal. You can get it cleaned." But Kendra was beyond reason now. She was fuming, her words sharp and brittle as she examined the bag with disdain. "This is unbelievable," she muttered, her voice trembling with frustration. Margaret, however, couldn't help herself. She didn't move to help or intervene. She simply turned, her expression calm, her hands clasped at her waist. She wasn't going to engage. Not now. Not anymore. As Kendra continued to rant, Margaret's eyes shifted to the other side of the baggage claim area. On the adjacent carousel, her own pristine bag, the one she had carried for years, was waiting. It had come out perfectly intact, no smudge of rain or damage from the journey. It was hers, and it was right where it needed to be. She walked slowly over to it, her steps measured and calm. As she grabbed the handle and lifted it from the carousel, she could feel Kendra's eyes on her, the burning intensity of them sharp at her back. But Margaret didn't look back. She didn't need to. In that moment, as she rolled the bag toward the exit, she felt the weight of everything shift. Control had always been in her hands, quietly, carefully, in the ways that counted most. And now, it felt like her turn to walk away, unburdened. Kendra's voice echoed behind her, but it was already fading, drowned out by the sound of the busy terminal, the rush of passengers and announcements. Margaret smiled to herself, the satisfaction of the moment lingering sweetly. She had made it through, and she was ready to move forward. Margaret stood at the door of Oaksfield, her hand resting lightly on the polished wood. The sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting a warm glow across the lobby. The scent of fresh flowers, roses, daisies, a hint of lavender filled the air, soothing and gentle. It was the kind of place that seemed to settle into your bones, as if it had always been waiting for you, patiently, without expectation. The manager, a woman in her mid-50s with silver hair pulled neatly into a bun, greeted her with a soft smile. She wore a light blue cardigan, the kind of color that invited calm. "Welcome to Oaksfield, Mrs. Grayson. We're so pleased to have you here." Margaret gave her a polite nod, her eyes sweeping the room with quiet appreciation. The walls were a pale, inviting cream, and the floors were polished hardwood, reflecting the light. The furniture was simple but comfortable, nothing flashy, just well-appointed, just enough. It was a place for living, not for impressing anyone, and it felt like home, already. The manager handed her a small bouquet of flowers wrapped in tissue paper and a personalized welcome folder. "We've prepared everything for you," she said, her voice warm. "Here's a list of activities, as well as your access pass for the building and amenities. Everything you'll need for your transition is in there." Margaret took the folder with both hands, feeling the weight of it in her palm. It was a symbol of new beginnings, of taking control, of a future she was finally ready to claim. She walked through the lobby with the manager who guided her past the common areas, inviting spaces where residents could gather, play chess or cards, enjoy the view. A dining room with white linens, a place for quiet conversations. The walls were dotted with artwork that conveyed serenity, peace, the kind of things Margaret had craved for years but never seemed to find. They arrived at her apartment, and Margaret couldn't help but pause at the door. There was something inherently right about the way the space felt, a quiet, personal kind of peace she hadn't known in years. The manager unlocked the door, and the room unfolded before her. Large windows, high ceilings, soft lighting that made everything feel like it had a place. The balcony overlooked a small garden, green and lush in the afternoon light. Beyond the garden, the world felt far away, as if she had stepped into a bubble of calm, a space just for her. The manager stepped back, giving Margaret space to take it all in. "It's yours, Mrs. Grayson. We've made sure everything is set up just as you like it. You have privacy, comfort, and everything you need to enjoy your time here." Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't forced but came from somewhere deep within her. It felt good. It felt real. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't doing this for anyone else. "I'll make sure the flowers are placed in the kitchen window," the manager continued. "And if there's anything else you need, anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." Margaret nodded, but her eyes were already scanning the room, a quiet excitement bubbling in her chest. She took a step into the apartment and set her bag down on the sleek, modern desk. She opened her suitcase, taking out a small frame of her airline wings, a memento from her days as a flight attendant. She had carried them with her for years, but now they felt like more than a piece of the past. They were a symbol of freedom, of everything she had fought for. With delicate hands, she placed the frame on the mantel by the door. It was a simple gesture, but it anchored her in this new space, this new chapter. She wasn't stepping away from her past, not entirely. She was simply placing it where it belonged, nearby, but not in control. Once the frame was in place, Margaret turned to the window, taking in the view. Her thoughts wandered, back to everything that had led her here. The years of effort, of sacrifice, of holding things together when it felt impossible. She thought of Andrew and Kendra, the arguments, the misunderstandings. But that was over now. She had done what she needed to do. As if on cue, her phone buzzed, breaking her moment of reflection. She picked it up, seeing the name on the screen. Sandra Lowe. "Margaret, you've done something none of them could ever imagine." Sandra's voice came through, sharp and clear. "They never thought you'd step aside on purpose. They thought you'd just fade away." Margaret's lips curled into a quiet smile, her eyes still trained on the view outside. "I'm not stepping aside, Sandra," she replied, her voice calm and steady. "I'm stepping around." She felt the weight of the words settle in, a truth she had only just begun to understand. She wasn't retreating, wasn't allowing anyone to take what was hers. She was choosing a different path, one that wasn't defined by the people who had never truly seen her. Sandra's laugh was warm, a breath of recognition. "Well, then I think it's about time we started living the way we were meant to." Margaret nodded, a quiet determination rising in her chest. She looked down at the folder in her hand, flipping it open to transfer a portion of the trust into the account for her future dues here. She would pay for her own peace, for her own space. No more waiting, no more compromise. She set the folder down and turned back to the balcony. The garden below swayed gently in the breeze. Everything around her was starting to feel like it belonged. She didn't need anyone's permission to live this way, to finally take what was hers. The sound of her phone vibrating on the table broke her thoughts. She glanced down at it, seeing a message from Olivia. "I can't wait to see you tomorrow." Margaret smiled to herself. The future was clear now, and she was ready to face it. More than ready. This was her time, and no one could take it from her. As she turned back to the view, the soft hum of the world outside filled her ears. She was exactly where she was meant to be. Margaret's phone rang just as she was finishing her lunch at Cafe Amelia. The warm sunlight streaming through the window onto the table in front of her. She picked it up without hesitation, already knowing who it was. "Hello, Sandra," Margaret said, her voice calm and steady. "Margaret, you need to know." Sandra's voice crackled through the line, a note of concern in her words. "Kendra just stormed into your old house. She's demanding an explanation. She doesn't understand why she's not in control anymore." Margaret's fingers gripped the edge of her coffee cup, her gaze drifting to the door of the cafe, where a soft breeze tugged at the edges of the curtains. She could almost picture Kendra's face, tight, angry, like someone whose carefully curated world had just been shattered. "I knew it was only a matter of time," Margaret replied quietly, leaning back in her chair. "She'll want to know why she's been left out. Why the house that she believed was hers isn't anymore." Sandra sighed. "Andrew was there too. He's just as stunned. He didn't know about the changes to the deed, but they were done legally, Margaret. Everything's in place." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, imagining the scene. Kendra pacing, Andrew caught in the middle, neither of them seeing what had been so obvious to her for months now. She had known this moment would come, the moment where everything would tip over, and the truth would rise to the surface. "I don't want to be cruel, Sandra," Margaret continued, her voice measured, "but this is my choice. I'm not playing by their rules anymore. I've been more than accommodating for years. It's time for them to learn what it means to respect the foundation we've built." The words felt like a weight lifted off her shoulders. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't backing down. This was her decision, and it had been made. "I understand," Sandra said softly. "And it's all legal, Margaret." Paige Brody had the new deed finalized over a month ago. The house is now part of a family trust that you control. It's all legally documented. Margaret smiled, the feeling of finality sinking in deeper. "Then they'll have to deal with it. But I'll give them time. They can relocate with dignity." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "Give them 90 days. That should be more than enough." Sandra's voice softened, a hint of approval in her tone. "You're doing what's right. What you should have done a long time ago." Margaret glanced around the cafe, the soft clink of dishes in the background, the hum of conversation. She had worked so hard for so long, but now she was free. Free from the constant battles, from the weight of everyone else's expectations. The world felt like it was opening up in a way it never had before. "I'll make the arrangements," Margaret said, her voice resolute. "I'll speak to Andrew. He'll have to accept it too. They both will." She ended the call and sat back in her chair, the sensation of relief washing over her. Margaret knew this wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about balance. It was about taking back what she had allowed others to take from her. Her dignity, her voice, her right to choose. As the final crumbs of her soup disappeared from the bowl, Margaret pushed the plate aside and looked out the window. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. She couldn't help but smile at the simple truth she had discovered. She didn't need anyone's permission to live her life the way she chose. The door to the cafe opened, and for a brief moment she felt a sense of peace settle in her chest. She wasn't looking over her shoulder anymore, wasn't second-guessing herself. Her path was clear, and she was moving forward. Back at the house, Kendra stood in the living room, her hands trembling with frustration as she glared at the stack of papers on the dining table. The new deed was right there in front of her, the official stamp glaring back at her like a judgment. Andrew stood behind her, his shoulders slumped, his hands clasped in front of him as if bracing himself for something. His eyes flicked nervously between Kendra and the papers. Kendra, it's legal. She's made it official. No, this can't be happening, Kendra muttered, her voice breaking, a tremor of disbelief running through her. We made plans for this place, Andrew. This was supposed to be ours. She couldn't have just done this without telling us. Andrew exhaled sharply, his frustration mixing with the guilt that had been weighing on him for weeks. She built this foundation before we were even married, Kendra. She has every right to control what happens with it. Kendra spun around, her eyes wild with anger. You're on her side now, too? After everything she's done to us? After all the sacrifices I've made? Andrew held his hands up in a gesture of helplessness, his voice weak. I'm not on anyone's side, Kendra, but we can't fight this. The house, it's hers now. She's the one who made the decisions, and we can't change that. Kendra's face twisted with frustration, and she turned away, glaring out the window. She's taken everything from us, Andrew. Everything. Andrew sighed, his face softening with regret. We still have each other. We'll figure this out. But Kendra's voice broke again, her eyes welling with tears. I didn't ask for any of this, she whispered, her voice raw. Margaret's words echoed in Andrew's mind. Then you should have treated its foundation with more respect. For the first time, Andrew felt a pang of understanding for his mother's quiet strength. He wasn't sure what the next few months would bring, but Margaret's actions were not born of malice. They were born of the quiet dignity she had fought so long to protect. And now it was his turn to decide where he would stand. The flight to Rome was smooth, almost too smooth for Margaret. She settled into her first-class seat, the plush leather embracing her as the cabin doors closed, the world outside slowly fading into the hum of engines. The flight attendants were courteous, offering her the warmth of a blanket, a glass of champagne, but Margaret hardly noticed. Her thoughts drifted, detached from the world around her, as she reclined her seat and gazed out the window. The city was no longer just a distant dream. It was hers to visit, to experience. It had been years since she had allowed herself to imagine this moment. Alone, free, without the weight of her family's expectations. Kendra and Andrew were nothing but distant memories now, their demands slipping away like water through her fingers. This trip wasn't about getting away from them. It was about getting to know herself again. A self she had almost forgotten existed. She thought of her late husband, William. He had always dreamed of visiting Rome, speaking of it in hushed tones on their lazy Sunday afternoons. It had always been a shared fantasy, one they never fulfilled. And now, here she was, finally going, alone. He would have loved this. The sun dipped low as the plane cruised over the Mediterranean, and Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, imagining William beside her. They had been good together once. But now, she understood. She had carried their dreams, their hopes, for too long. It was time to let them go. The flight touched down gently, the city of Rome sprawling below her like a living canvas, its ancient buildings standing against the sky. She wasn't in a rush. She didn't need to be. This was her time, hers alone. Margaret checked into her boutique hotel, a charming place, tucked away from the tourist crowds with ivy climbing up the stone walls. The room was small but elegant, with soft linens and a window that framed a perfect view of the city. She unpacked slowly, carefully placing her belongings in the drawers. She wasn't here to be anyone's idea of a traveler. She was here to be simply herself. No expectations, no obligations. Later that afternoon, she wandered the cobbled streets, a light breeze rustling through the trees. The city, with its tangled alleys and hidden courtyards, felt like a world unto itself. She found herself drawn to a small cafe tucked in a quiet corner near the Piazza Navona, one that William had often talked about visiting. She could almost hear his voice in her mind, his excitement at the thought of sitting here together, savoring espresso and pastries. Inside, the cafe was cozy, intimate. The low murmur of other patrons blended with the clink of china cups, and the scent of fresh coffee filled the air. She chose a table by the window, the sunlight warming her skin. A kind server approached, smiling warmly as she handed Margaret the menu. "Is someone joining you?" the server asked politely. Margaret smiled, her heart fluttering with a mixture of melancholy and satisfaction. "No," she replied, her voice soft but certain. "And that's the point." The server smiled back, sensing the quiet peace in her words, and left her to her thoughts. Margaret sat back, gazing out the window at the bustling square. The people walking by, the street vendors, the artists painting portraits. Everything was full of life, but for Margaret, it was enough to simply be there, in the moment, on her own. For once, she wasn't defined by anyone else's expectations. She was free. Back home, the world continued to spin in a way Margaret had long grown accustomed to, though it felt like a distant hum now. Kendra had already begun scrambling to apply for temporary housing. The family home, now just a house in her eyes, was no longer theirs to claim. Kendra's anger still simmered, but Margaret didn't concern herself with it. Let her fight for control. Margaret had let go of that battle long ago. Andrew, meanwhile, had called Olivia. The tension in his voice was clear, though he tried to mask it with the same neutral tone he always used. "Your grandmother's gone rogue," Andrew said, his words laced with disbelief. "She's off to Rome, doing things her way. It's like she doesn't care about any of us anymore." Olivia's response was simple, but it carried a weight of understanding. "She's just finally flying solo." Andrew paused, uncertain. "I don't know what to make of this. She's never acted like this before." Olivia's voice softened, a hint of a smile in her tone. "Maybe it's because she's finally doing what's right for her, what she always needed to do." Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Margaret was sitting at her cafe table, enjoying the solitude of the moment. She checked her phone. There was a message from Sandra. "Just wanted to let you know, we've finalized everything. The trust transfer is complete. Everything is in place for your peace of mind." Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the weight of Sandra's words. The will had been updated. The trust had been secured. Everything was in its rightful place, just as she had wanted. She tapped a quick reply. "Thank you, Sandra. Everything feels clear now." As she put the phone down, she looked at the glass of wine in front of her, and then out at the bustling streets of Rome. The future had been waiting for her all along, and now she was ready to embrace it with open arms. Margaret was free, at peace, and for the first time in years, everything felt right. And the best part? No one could take that from her. The morning sun bathed Margaret's apartment in golden light as she sat by the window, sipping her coffee. The world outside seemed distant now, the hustle and bustle of life in Rome just another layer she had pulled back to reveal something more vital: peace. She was no longer part of the chaos. She had carved out a life that was completely hers. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her back into the moment. The name on the screen was familiar. Sandra Lowe. "Margaret, you're trending." Sandra's voice crackled through the line. There was a mixture of concern and something else in her tone. "It's all over the local news. Your story. About the trust. The house. People are talking." Margaret's first reaction was a quiet, amused smile. She had expected something like this. She had anticipated the public attention after the changes to the trust became official, but there was no fear in her heart, no hesitation. This was just another chapter. "I don't care about the noise, Sandra," Margaret said, her voice calm, unaffected. "I've made my choice. I'm living it." Sandra paused before speaking again, the quiet hum of the phone line stretching between them. It's not just the locals, it's going viral. Kendra shared the article herself. I thought you should know. Margaret's brow furrowed. She hadn't anticipated Kendra's response, but then again, she hadn't expected her daughter-in-law to keep her silence for long. It didn't matter. Kendra's venom wasn't her problem anymore. I'll look at it later, Margaret replied. Thank you for letting me know. She hung up, placing her phone on the table. The headline Sandra had mentioned was already burning in the back of her mind. She knew what it would say. Family trust reversed. Mother takes control after years of silence. Margaret had learned to move with quiet purpose, and now the world would see her clarity, her independence. Back home, Kendra sat in her living room, her fingers clenched tightly around her phone. She had already shared the article with Andrew, her voice tight with frustration. Look at this, she hissed, her finger tapping the screen aggressively. She's made herself a hero, she's written her own story, and everyone's buying it. The article was everywhere, on local news websites, social media, and even shared among their close circle of friends. The narrative had already taken shape. Margaret Grayson, the woman who had been taken for granted, had finally taken control of her life, of her legacy. The world was celebrating her decision. But Kendra wasn't celebrating. Her anger burned through her veins as she read the words again, feeling the sting of betrayal. She can't just steal everything, Kendra muttered, scrolling through the comments section. People don't know the full story. They don't know what she's taken from us. Andrew sat silently next to her, his hands resting in his lap, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. He had tried to play both sides, tried to avoid confrontation, but now there was no way to ignore it. What do we do? He asked quietly. Kendra's face twisted with rage. We fight back, she snapped, her eyes flashing. We can't just let her walk away with this. She has no right to do this to our family. But Andrew said nothing. The more he thought about Margaret's actions, the more he began to understand. His mother had been right all along. She had built the foundation of the family's wealth and legacy, and now she was reclaiming it. He wasn't sure he agreed with every decision she had made, but he couldn't deny the strength she had shown in doing it. Meanwhile, Olivia was on the other side of the world, her phone buzzing with messages from her friends. She'd shared the article proudly, knowing full well that Margaret's actions had shaken things up, but also knowing that her grandmother's courage was something to be celebrated. That's my grandma, Olivia texted to one of her friends, her fingers flying over the keyboard. She's finally doing what she needed to do all along. Her friends replied quickly, their comments full of admiration. She's a badass. Wow, go Grandma! Olivia smiled to herself as she read the messages, the pride in her heart swelling. It had taken time for her to see it, but now she understood. Margaret had never been weak. She had never been a woman to cower. She had just needed the right moment to rise, and that moment had come. Back in Rome, Margaret glanced down at her phone, which buzzed with notifications. Hundreds of comments had flooded in, mostly supportive, some critical, and a few dismissive. But she wasn't interested in engaging with them. She wasn't here to defend herself. She wasn't here to argue. She knew exactly what she had done, and for the first time, she didn't need anyone's approval. The decision was hers, and the world would see it on her terms. Margaret opened the photo gallery on her phone and began saving the screenshots of the article, just a few select ones. She wasn't interested in reading every single comment. But there was something about seeing it all laid out that felt definitive. Her past was no longer holding her back. It had all been written, and it couldn't be unwritten. She saved a few copies to her phone, and then, with a quiet sigh, transferred them to a folder labeled Legacy. She wasn't going to reply to any of the comments. She wasn't going to engage in any public battles. She was beyond that. Silence is loud when it's earned, Margaret whispered to herself as she looked out over the city, the streets below bustling with life. The article would fade eventually. The public would move on to the next story, but her silence would be her answer, louder than any argument, clearer than any defense. She wasn't interested in being a footnote in someone else's story. She was writing her own now, and that was enough. The park was quiet as Margaret walked through the shaded paths, the soft rustle of leaves filling the air. The scent of fresh grass mingled with the earthy smell of the trees, and the city's bustle felt like a distant hum. She had chosen this park deliberately, far enough from the crowds to escape the noise, close enough to be connected, but just enough of a barrier to keep things at a distance. The soft green of the grass underfoot was a reminder that life moved forward, even in the quietest moments. She had agreed to meet Andrew here, despite the unease she felt. He had reached out a week ago, asking for a conversation, an apology, she presumed. It had taken him longer than she would have liked to come to terms with what she had done. But Andrew was her son, and despite everything, she knew that the years of distance couldn't be undone in a single moment. She reached the bench where they had agreed to meet. Margaret sat down, folding her hands neatly in her lap. She wasn't here to fight. She wasn't here to listen to excuses. She was here to speak her truth. Andrew arrived shortly after, his steps slow and deliberate, as if weighing each one before moving forward. He looked different, more tired, more worn, but his eyes still held the same uncertainty. "Mom," he said quietly, sitting down beside her. "Thank you for meeting me." Margaret nodded, offering a small, encouraging smile, but her eyes remained steady. She had learned to listen without reacting too quickly, and that was what she intended to do now. Andrew sighed, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his jacket. I don't know where to start." His voice faltered, and she could see the rawness in him. "I don't know how we got here, but I know I've been so neutral for so long, and I shouldn't have been. Kendra, her cruelty, everything that happened. I didn't do enough to stop it." Margaret kept her gaze focused ahead, but she felt the weight of his words. He had been a bystander in his own life for too long, floating between loyalties, unable to choose. She knew it wasn't easy to step out of that fog, but she also knew that now, finally, he was seeing things more clearly. "I should have been more supportive," he continued, his voice cracking slightly. "I shouldn't have let her treat you that way or let her pull me into it. I'm sorry. For everything." Margaret let him speak, her expression open, but her mind was far from reactive. She wasn't angry at Andrew. He had his own journey to walk, his own lessons to learn. But she had already made her decisions. She didn't need to be validated, didn't need to be apologized to. She needed him to understand. When he finished, the silence lingered. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was just a pause, a moment of clarity between them. Margaret shifted slightly, then reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. She placed it on the bench between them. Andrew glanced at the envelope, then back at her, uncertainty still clouding his face. "What's this?" he asked. "A letter," Margaret said simply. "You asked for a conversation, and I'm giving you one. But it's not a discussion." She paused, her gaze steady. "This is a path forward, but one with boundaries." Andrew picked up the envelope, his fingers running along the crease. He was about to ask more, but Margaret held up a hand, her tone firm but not unkind. "I've already done what needed to be done, Andrew. I've spent years listening, years trying to make everything fit into a space that was never mine to control. That ends now. The trust is settled, and I've made sure everything is in place for my peace." He opened the envelope slowly, scanning the letter inside. His eyes moved quickly, but as he read, his expression softened. The silence stretched between them as he took in the words. Clear terms, carefully outlined. Margaret had made it simple, unambiguous. There was no room for misinterpretation. She had laid down the law, so to speak, but with an understanding. If Andrew wanted a place in her life, he would need to respect her decisions. If he wanted a relationship with her, it would have to be on her terms, not the terms dictated by Kendra's influence or the past mistakes that lingered like ghosts. After a long pause, Andrew put the letter down, his eyes now fully focused on his mother. His voice was low, almost reluctant, but there was a sense of resolution in it. "This is fair." Margaret nodded. "It's overdue." She didn't offer any further explanation. She didn't need to. He had heard her words. He understood now. And that was enough. For a long moment they sat in silence, the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the park. Andrew's shoulders were slightly slumped, but he no longer seemed like the same man who had arrived, a man caught between two worlds. He had accepted what Margaret had offered, a clear, defined space where they could rebuild their relationship, but only if he was willing to meet her where she was. Margaret rose from the bench, smoothing out her coat. She glanced at Andrew one last time. "I'll always be your mother," she said, her voice steady but warm. "But I won't be anyone else's idea of what that should mean. I'm not stepping back anymore. I'm stepping forward." Andrew didn't reply immediately. Instead, he nodded once, slowly, as if accepting that this was how things were now. Margaret wasn't asking for anything from him. She was simply standing firm in her own truth. As she turned to leave, her heart was lighter than it had been in years. She wasn't waiting for Andrew's approval, nor was she asking for his forgiveness. She had already moved on. And now, for the first time in a long time, she was walking forward, unburdened and free. And for the first time in years, she didn't look back. The doorbell chimed softly, pulling Margaret from the quiet sanctuary of her morning routine. She smiled as she stood up, the sound of footsteps approaching the door. Olivia's visits had become a welcome comfort, a gentle reminder of what had endured through the years, the love that had never wavered, no matter how far apart they had been. It was no longer about trying to repair what was broken, but about building something new. And with Olivia, there was no pressure, no drama, no expectations. It was simply warmth. Margaret opened the door to find Olivia standing there. Her face lit up with a grin that made Margaret's heart feel a little lighter. "Grandma," Olivia said, stepping forward and wrapping Margaret in a quick hug. "I brought some pastries. I thought we could have a quiet breakfast together." Margaret chuckled, pulling back and taking the small bag of treats from Olivia's hands. "You're spoiling me. Thank you." Olivia's laughter filled the air, an easy, unburdened sound that made Margaret feel at home. She led Olivia to the small kitchen, where the sunlight poured in through the window, casting a soft glow over the table. They sat across from one another, the warmth of the moment settling comfortably around them. "So," Olivia began, after a few moments of enjoying the pastries, "tell me about your flight attendant days. What was it like?" Margaret leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting toward the window. The memories were there, tucked away in the corners of her mind. They felt distant, but not in a way that made her sad. They were just a part of her, a chapter that had come and gone. "It was a different time," Margaret began, her voice soft but steady. "We flew all over, to places people only dreamed of. But it wasn't glamorous, not like people think. It was a job, one where you had to be on your feet all day, navigating tight spaces and endless routines. But there was also something about it, something freeing. I saw the world, Olivia, and I did it on my own terms." Olivia watched her with wide eyes hanging on every word. "Did you ever feel scared? Alone?" Margaret's smile was gentle, and there was a depth in her eyes that Olivia had never seen before. I was never alone, she said softly. But yes, sometimes it was scary. Being away from home, always moving, never knowing when you'd return. But I learned a lot about the world and about myself. It taught me how to be independent, how to trust my instincts. Olivia nodded thoughtfully, her gaze distant for a moment. Then she smiled, her voice light. Sounds like you knew how to pack for every trip. Margaret chuckled. I did, but it wasn't just about packing for the job. It was about knowing how to pack for life. There's a certain way you learn to travel lightly. Carry only what you need. Don't weigh yourself down with unnecessary things. Olivia raised an eyebrow. So, is that why you've always had so few things? You've been packing light your whole life? Margaret's smile softened. That's part of it. But more than that, it's about learning not to hold on to things that don't serve you. People, expectations, things. Life's a lot easier when you don't carry all that weight with you. The words hung in the air for a moment, and Olivia looked at her grandmother, understanding something deeper than she had before. She had always admired Margaret's strength, but now, in this moment, she saw how much more there was to her. The lessons Margaret had learned were woven into everything she did, into the way she lived, into the way she had chosen to be free. Olivia placed her mug down gently and asked, Grandma, you always knew you were leaving them behind, didn't you? Andrew and Kendra, I mean. You knew they wouldn't understand. Margaret's gaze turned inward for a moment, as if remembering the weight of all that had come before. She took a slow breath. Her voice calm, but firm. No, I didn't know I was leaving them behind, Olivia. I just knew I wasn't going to follow them into smallness. I couldn't let their view of the world, of what I should be, dictate how I lived. The words seemed to settle around them, a quiet wisdom that Olivia absorbed. It wasn't about cutting ties with her family. It was about choosing her own path, her own freedom. For the first time, Olivia understood that her grandmother wasn't just making a stand against her past. She was choosing the life she deserved, one built on her own terms. A few moments passed in silence, the kind that felt comfortable, natural. Then Olivia looked up with a mischievous grin. Can I plan our next trip? She asked, her voice full of excitement. Margaret's eyes twinkled and she laughed softly. Of course. I think it's time for us to take that trip, don't you? Olivia's face lit up, and she leaned in, already buzzing with ideas. How about Paris? Or maybe something off the beaten path? A place no one else would think of? Margaret smiled, feeling the energy between them shift into something new. Anywhere you want, Olivia. As long as it's with you, it will be perfect. The thought of a trip with Olivia, of stepping into a future that was full of possibilities and free from the weight of the past, filled Margaret with a sense of peace that had been missing for so long. The world was wide open now, and for the first time in years, Margaret Grayson was not just ready to see it, she was ready to live it. As they continued to talk, the light in the room shifted, the day moving toward evening, and for the first time in a long time, Margaret knew that this new chapter was not only hers to write, it was one she was going to share with someone who truly understood. No regrets, no burdens, just the future. And that was everything. Margaret wheeled her bag through the airport terminal, the familiar, smooth hum of the wheels on the polished floor grounding her in the present. The bag was the same one Kendra had once shoved aside, years ago, at the gate, when the first cracks had started to show. That moment had felt like the end of something, a sign that things could never go back to how they were. But here she was, pushing it forward, unbothered by the past, feeling every step she took as her own. The airport was busy, travelers rushing from one gate to the next, but Margaret didn't rush. There was no need. The anxiety she had once carried, The stress of trying to keep things together was long gone. Now she moved with a calmness, a quiet determination, as if every step she took was deliberate. Olivia walked beside her, her pace matching Margaret's. Olivia had checked them in moments earlier, her voice light but firm when she handed over the boarding passes. No questions, no hesitation. This time, there were no looks of surprise when they approached the first-class desk. No one questioned who belonged at the front of the plane, who deserved the comfort of a spacious seat. This was their space now. Olivia glanced up at her, her face glowing with a mixture of pride and joy. "We're all set, Grandma," she said, a small smile curling on her lips. Margaret didn't respond right away. She just kept walking, feeling the warmth of the terminal, the quiet sense of finality that had settled within her. Her thoughts drifted back to the last time she had walked through this airport, the first time with Kendra, when everything had felt wrong, when Kendra's subtle jabs and attempts at control had been too much to ignore. But now, with Olivia by her side, the past seemed to fade into the background. It was no longer relevant. It had no claim over her. When they arrived at the gate, Margaret took a deep breath and looked around. The crowd wasn't paying attention to her, but in her mind, she could feel the quiet triumph. She had made her choice. She had claimed her space. Olivia handed over their boarding passes to the attendant, who smiled and motioned them through. The jet bridge felt long, but to Margaret it was only a few short steps away from a future that was fully hers. They walked down the corridor together, the sound of their footsteps in sync. When they reached the door to the plane, Margaret paused. She felt a flicker of something, a memory of the times when she had always followed. She thought of Kendra, of Andrew, of all the people who had once tried to shape her. But none of it mattered now. The flight attendant smiled at them as they passed, greeting Olivia by name and guiding Margaret to her seat with the quiet respect she had earned. They settled into their seats, Margaret by the window, Olivia beside her. For a moment, Margaret glanced out the window, looking at the runway ahead of her. She wasn't looking for something she had lost, nor was she searching for the future. She was simply letting the present fill her. Olivia buckled her seatbelt, her face lighting up as she caught her grandmother's gaze. "Ready, Grandma?" Margaret smiled softly, the curve of her lips warm and knowing. "Always." And as the plane began to taxi down the runway, Margaret felt the weight of her life, of the choices she had made, of the paths she had walked, shift. It wasn't about the destination, not anymore. It was about how she had arrived. The roar of the engines filled the cabin as the plane lifted into the sky. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the gentle lift of the plane beneath her, her body relaxed, grounded in the stillness of the moment. As she sat there, in the comfort of her seat, a thought surfaced. One final quiet realization. At the airport, my son's wife kicked my bag aside. The ticket I booked wasn't hers to board. But now, Margaret Grayson was boarding her own future. And nothing could stop her.